Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, O Lord. So Jesus and the disciples went on, and passing through Galilee, he did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent. For on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. So Jesus sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it into his arms, he said to them, Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. So they just really don't get it, do they? I mean, how many times does Jesus need to talk about his betrayal and his execution and his resurrection to these disciples? How many times will he need to tell them to focus on the marginalized, the lowly, the poor, and the outcast? It's as though the disciples will never understand what Jesus is saying. And part of the reason I feel that way about Mark's gospel is, well, frankly, even just last week's gospel here, Jesus made the first prediction of his fate. He reminded the disciples to take the way of the cross by serving instead of lording over. And frankly, the beginning of today's gospel and even the part after the disciples were arguing, well, it sounds a lot like last week. And it just is mind-boggling to me that we have to hear the same thing over and over again. These disciples, they don't get Jesus' identity as the Messiah. They don't understand that he is the anointed one or the Christ. The disciples don't understand, or they choose not to understand, where Jesus' ministry and mission is heading. For 9 chapters now, Jesus has been explaining the main message, but they still seem like it is their very first day on the job. And I imagine that Jesus felt like a broken record, saying the same thing, repeatedly saying that the Messiahship isn't about ruling, it's about serving. Jesus repeatedly saying, I'm going to be betrayed, I'm going to be executed, I'm going to resurrect again. Again and again and again, he says the same thing. He says the same message about including those left out, the same thing about welcoming the strangers, the same thing about centralizing the marginalized. It's about love, he says. It's about justice, he says. It's about peace, he says. When will these silly disciples finally understand so we can hear something new on a rainy Sunday morning? And frankly, I understand that feeling. I imagine you do too. I mean, how many times over 11 years have I had to say that church work and nonprofit work is about being a community together and making communal decisions and not about the individual or one person? How many times have I stood here and said the same darn sermon over and over again? God loves you. Please be kind. It is about justice. Let's love one another. It is about inclusion. How many times have I said the same thing over and over again? How many times do we as parents and teachers have to remind kids to share their toys and don't stick your finger in the electrical socket and no, don't touch the stove when it's on? We say the same things over and over again. How many times do we need to tell people that anti-racism work is not about people of color teaching us white people how to think and see the world differently? Or how many times do we need to explain that the gender is not a binary of one or the other? Or how many times do we need to say that women's rights are human rights? Or how many times do we need to say Black Lives Matter or trans lives matter? How many times do we need to say Jesus was an immigrant, or Christianity is not about nationalism, or that being poor is not a crime? I mean, how many times must we say it this way and that way and come up with a new story to catch people's attention, seemingly making not a difference in what we do? How many times, oh Lord, how many times? Do you ever feel that way? No? No one ever feels that way, just me? Well, good. I guess keep paying me so I can feel that way, and you can feel like everything is good and swimmingly. Well, let me tell you a story. I entered seminary back in 2008, and it was a time before our denomination allowed those of us who were queer to be out and ordained in the church. Now, I specifically went to the seminary in Philadelphia because it was known for being a place that protected and advocated for queer seminarians before the church ever allowed it. Now, as is often true about those on the margins, us queer folk, well, we still somehow find a way to find each other in spaces and seminaries, and even before Grindr existed, we could figure out who they were. Now, I remember finding out one day that one of the professors of Christian history used to be ordained in one of the earlier denominations before the ELCA became a thing. But there came a time where he was defrocked, a fancy way of saying he was removed, he wasn't allowed to be a pastor anymore. Turned out the reason why he was removed is that he had a long-time partner who happened to be of the same gender. Now, I remember asking him about it. I asked him, why do you stick around? How do you get through it? Why do you bother with this screwed up denomination? And being his extremely sarcastic self, with probably the most dry sense of humor I've ever met, he said, "There's nothing new under the sun. There's nothing new under the sun." Now, being a young and rather naive seminary student, I didn't really quite make the connection to the biblical passage he was invoking from Ecclesiastes. And you see, there in Ecclesiastes, the author is complaining about the monotony of life. But my professor wasn't just saying that life was monotonous, but rather he was naming something that he saw throughout all of history. Not only is much of life repeating what has already been done in some form or fashion, but unfortunately, restricting people from being pastors has long been a power tactic from the very beginning of the church. Whether it was saying, well, if you're married, you can't be ordained, or if you're a woman, you can't be ordained, or you're queer and you can't be ordained. You see, this human tendency to want to be the greatest, the best, the most preferred, to keep your job security so that those immigrants don't come and take it over, that is a human feeling. That is a thing that we see across all of time. You see, the church isn't the only entity that suffers from the same old cycles of control and power and privilege and competition. We have seen this story over and over again. We have seen the human tendency to cause ecological destruction on environments throughout all of history. Scholars tell us that the Mayans likely ended their civilization due to slash and burn agriculture that destroyed forests and led to a mega drought. In Iran, in Iraq, in Jordan, the Fertile Crescent, well, that was likely destroyed by deforestation and salinization and overgrazing. And so, too, we could think about the Persians or the Greeks or the Romans or the Vikings or even the Polynesians, who also destroyed their own environments and led to their demise. So sure, this time our looming ecological catastrophe is globalized, and that is rightfully scary and on a different level than we've seen before. But the essence of how humanity has tended to work, it is an ever-recurring issue with taking too much and destroying our own environments. Dare we say there is nothing new under the sun? Or what about the recurring issue of people actually choosing fascism for a government? I mean, this isn't anything new. If you look at the biblical scriptures, we see that there were once judges over the land, and then they lifted up and they said, okay, let's replace it with kings. This is in the Hebrew scriptures. And then we've also read about it and taught about it, about Germany and what was literally elected as a fascist government. And dare I say, we have hints of it in our own time. There is nothing new under the sun. From generation to generation, we seem to have to constantly advocate for the rights of those on the margins. We see the elderly protester holding up signs saying, I can't believe I have to still protest this crap. It is a reminder to us that each generation responds to the same injustice regarding the respect of women or queer folk or BIPOC individuals or immigrants. We as a people focus on the wrong things. We don't learn. We don't change. We don't learn from the past. And darn it, we prove that there is nothing new under the sun. It is the same old thing day in and day out, over and over again. It is depressing. It is infuriating. But it is entirely, as my professor reminded me, predictable. And so, if you're anything like me, I sometimes feel annoyed by the people like the disciples who don't seem to listen, that there is no change. But at the same time, if we were to look in the mirror and really think about it, we are equally those same disciples, failing to relearn, failing to remember. Yet the good news about today's gospel, indeed I might say the whole Gospel of Mark, where we repeat things over and over and over again, is that we have a God who steps in and is willing to go at lengths to repeat the same message. Our God doesn't give up. Our God sees the small, minor movements forward. Our God is a God who will shout so that the people in the back can hear it, who will repeat the same message, who will point to the Christian symbol of execution as a reminder for us to care for those on the margins, a God who will literally pick up a child in today's reading and put it in the center and say, look, I can't make it any more clear to you, disciples. This is what it is about. It is about those on the margins. It is about the people who can't advocate for themselves. This is what God's work is about. We have a God who will stop at literally nothing to center those on the margins. A God who will name the realities of this world, who will expose the structures of inequality and the agents of oppression, and a God who will say it again and again and again, because here's the thing about our God. While we humans may just be caught up in an endless cycle of selfishness and destruction, our God is caught up in a more powerful, endless cycle of reminding you that you are loved, that our God's focus on this world that tries to exterminate and ignore others will continue to be about those very people, and our God will stop at nothing to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat the same thing over and over again as our world slowly moves to God's abundant reign of love and justice and peace. And so yes, today's reading, it's a lot like last week's reading. But until we as a people can come to truly love our neighbors, until we welcome the outcast, until we center the most vulnerable, then we need to hear it every single week. We need to be reminded of that opportunity to break the world's cycle and join in God's repetition. For God is not only saying it for us, but God is saying it to transform us so that we might be like beacons going out in the world, strengthened by God's holy repetition of love, so that we might respond to that feeling of that there's nothing new under the sun, and instead say, we are God's beloved. We are loved. All are respected, and we will continue to repeat God's message of love. May we be so empowered to do that, for we have a God who's willing to repeat it and will repeat it for the sake of our beloved world. Amen.